Welcome. My name is Mark Ray. I am Executive Director of the Grace Center for Spiritual Development and your host for Grace Cafe today. I want to welcome you all, ask you to log on to Grace Center Cafe, share it with your friends, make sure that in these next 4 weeks, you're not going to want to miss what we're going to be having a discussion about. Not that you wanted to miss the previous ones, but we've got a really special month of June set up for us. And we're excited that you're a part of it. So if you would go grab your favorite tea or your favorite cup of coffee, make it, come back and join us. We're going to have a fantastic conversation over these next 4 weeks with good friend Dr. Nick. Nick, glad to have you here. From where in Florida are you?
Today I'm down here in South Florida, Fort Lauderdale.
South Florida.
Working with the church, helping design their educational structures. But normally I'm based out of Dallas, Texas.
Yeah. So grab your cup of coffee, log on with us, come join us. If you can't join us here, make sure you log on afterwards. But also, we'd like to ask you to make sure you share Grace Cafe with your friends. We want to get more of the word out there to your friends on the conversations that we're having here. And this series of conversations, I want to give you an introduction into where we're headed over these next 4 weeks. Dr. Ellis, who has gotten his DPhil from Oxford, spends a tremendous amount of his time up in the scholarly levels. He is a scholar, he's an educator, he is an author, he is a speaker, has a pastoral heart, but more than anything else, as founder and CEO of GDI, which is an organization that's geared to education globally, he's got a heart for how do we bring that education directly to the people, right where they need it, when they need it, how they need it, to educate them with an understanding that out of Romans 12, transformation begins with renewing the mind with education, with new thoughts and new concepts. So again, grab that cup of coffee, come join us, log on, share us, and be part of this conversation. Nick, what I'm excited about is the opportunity to talk about, and I'm going to put an umbrella category over this, the Jewishness of Jesus. And the reason I'm putting that there is because we, especially in the Western world, we have a tendency to think of Jesus as my friend, almost to think of him in a Western context rather than the context in which he began his ministry, what came before him, what came after him. That there really is an element that we seem to miss out on, and that is the Jewishness, especially that audience that he was talking to, and contextually what that meant to the messages that he brought. Why is this such an area of passion for you?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. This has been an area of passion for me, really all the way going back to my early studies, when I began to just read through the literature that was coming out from the time of the exile of Israel all the way through the Gospels, and begin to see Jesus as part of a conversation, see him as part of a culture, see him as part of the questions that he's answering, the things that he's pushing back on. There's a context that he's part of. And so much of this was driven by me just wanting to read and understand Jesus better. When he says things, and I think kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God, Son of Man, the law, all these kind of things, it's like, I don't really know what those mean, because I'm a Christian and I'm under grace. I don't really know I have no point of reference to understand any of this stuff. And so Pharisees, well, where did they come from? I don't know who those guys are. Sadducees, all these sects and all this stuff that felt so foreign, and really wanting to dig into Jesus and understand what Jesus was saying. If he is truly my teacher, if he is truly my rabbi, if he's truly my Lord, I want to understand what Jesus is talking about.
Well, especially given the fact that you've got an entire Old Testament that, and I've heard it said many times by us as believers, well, that's the Old Testament. You want to focus on the New Testament. The New Testament is absolutely reflective of and a continuation of the ministry of the Old Testament. And if we divorce those two, then contextually the New Testament, we either misinterpret it or it doesn't make sense at all. So there's a construct there that the two have to fit together. And there are big picture issues and there are small picture issues in both of those.
That's right. And so when Jesus kind of sets this up for me, if there's a single text that became the fulcrum point for me to really push into this, is when I read Jesus saying several times in every one of the Gospels to his disciples, do not go to the Gentiles, go to the lost sheep of Israel.
Okay.
And I read this in the Gospels and I think, what does that even mean?
Yeah. Does that mean?
Am I a disciple of Jesus?
Is his message not for me? Yeah.
Is his message not for me? Do I go to the lost sheep of Israel? Like, what does this mean?
Yeah.
And that's when I begin to get a sense that something is going on here, some big story, some long, almost, cross-epoch story that I'm part of, and I'm not getting the whole story. And so that's
how am I part of it? Yeah.
That's right. And my passion is drawing people into a story that really goes all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, extends through Israel, extends to where I am now. And how does Jesus kind of fit within that story?
Well, and that's an interesting statement. You just talked about God who says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But you also have Christ who says, I and the Father are one, which means that Christ is also the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If that's the case, then there is this connecting point between all of that affects not only the Jews, but affects us as Gentiles.
Yes.
That's a huge thing. So we're setting kind of the backdrop to where we're going over these next 4 weeks. This week, we're going to really kind of set a foundation for conversation in the next 3 weeks about Jesus' mission, the mission of the apostles, then following Jesus' ascension, the mission of the apostles to the Jews, and then the mission of the apostles to the Gentiles. But in order to set all that up, we've got to have some frame of reference, correct?
That's right. That's right.
And
so
that frame, let me set the stage real quick. That frame of reference that we've talked about, that frame of reference really is the Second Temple period. Now, that's a phrase that may confuse a whole lot of people. So when I say Second Temple Judaism, describe that for us, because that's the time period that we want to focus on over these next couple of weeks.
That's right. And so, first of all, it requires us to go back to the exile, the event of the exile. And if you remember, when God gave his covenant to Moses and to the people of Israel, he said, if you obey this covenant, then you'll flourish in the land, and he meant the land of Israel. But and he actually said, when you break this covenant, I will scatter you across the nations. And it turns out that's exactly what they did. The 12 tribes of Israel, the 10 tribes in the north, and then Judah in Israel, both of them under separate kings, they rebelled against God, and as a result, in two different periods, in 722 before Christ, the northern kingdom was invaded and taken out of Israel and spread across the Assyrian Empire. And then in 586 before Christ, the southern kingdom, Judah, was also exiled and spread across the known world at the time. And so this is called the Diaspora. It's a Greek word, Diaspora, which means to literally seed or to sow Israel. And so there's a sense where
throwing
Israel
the seed out. Yeah.
They're scattered, and the seed has been scattered across the known world. Some do return. And so you have Zerubbabel come back with about 50,000 people, and then Ezra brings back another 15,000, right. And there's, Nehemiah starts to bring some of these back, and I think a lot of people think, all of the Jews are back in Israel by the time you get to the first century. And actually, what you have is, yes, they do come back, and yes, they build another temple. And so this is Ezra. They come back and they build another temple. Zerubbabel rebuilds the temple, and they begin to worship again in Jerusalem. And so from the time that they rebuild the temple onward until 70 AD, when it's redestroyed, the second temple is destroyed by Rome, that's called the Second Temple period. It's about 700 years of period. And it's the era in Jewish life when they're not ruling themselves, when they don't have a king over themselves, they're not autonomous, they're part of some other kingdom, whether it's Babylon or Assyria or the Greek Empire or the Roman Empire. They're under subjugation, and they're looking for, when is this promise that God made to David in 2 Samuel 7? When is this eternal kingdom going to be reconstituted? When is this son of David that God says, he will be a son to me and his kingdom shall have no end? When is this going to happen? And it's really significant to understand that people are looking for this kingdom to be reconstituted, and they're not just in Judah. They're not just in Israel.
Yeah.
So we have, by the 1st century BC, we have archaeological evidence of Jewish communities as far west as Spain and as far east as the Yangtze River in China. So you've got 700 years of growth, dispersion, migration, change. Just think of my own German family that came to the U.S. from Austria in 1890. Well, I don't think of myself as German. I mean, I know there's German heritage. I kind of know where I came from, but I'm not looking to move back to Switzerland. I don't speak German very well. And that's only 100 years.
Yeah.
That's 150 years.
700 is another story. Yes.
700 years.
And how old is America?
That's right. So twice, 3 times as long as America. These Jews have been scattered all over the known world. They are following Torah. They are wondering, how do I read and interpret my Bible? They have commentators that are writing. So in some way, they're a lot like us. They're a lot like us, where we're waiting for our Messiah. We're waiting for the kingdom of God. We have experts that we lean on, our commentators and our teachers and our professors. There's a tremendous amount of literature that's been written during this period of time that the Jews are reading and trying to understand and trying to be good Jews. Basically, they're trying to accurately read, understand, interpret, and apply the law of Moses. And they're waiting for something to happen because they believe that the prophets have said, one day you'll be brought back. This kingdom will be reconstituted. And so this is the political, cultural, historical context that's being set up. And from this begins to emerge a lot of different groups. And so we call these sects or sectarian Judaism. And this is kind of a natural phenomenon that occurs. I mean, pick any group of people, ask them to interpret a text, and sectarianism is going to happen. You could call this Baptists and Methodists in our context, right?
So there are these different denominational interpretations of what Scripture has actually said. And to put it, not too fine a point to it, when you get the beginning of the rebuilding of the wall, so you're in the Ezra and Nehemiah time period, you still got Esther sitting out here, that book that says they didn't all come back. So here's a group that haven't returned, and here's a group that haven't returned, and here these would be groups that are outside of the return to Jerusalem, where you gotta think the home place of thought, the home place of scholarship, the home place of interpretation. But they're also out here in the hinterlands, still trying to be good Jews.
And you have, so for example, the place where the Talmud was written, this whole kind of Jewish commentary and law was not. I mean, you have a Jerusalem Talmud, but you have a Babylonian Talmud.
Right.
You have a very strong center of Judaism in Babylon. You have certainly more Jews living outside of the land than you do internally to the land. You have maybe 1 million Jews living in Alexandria. You have Jews living in India. You have all of these Jewish communities, like we said, from Spain to China. And the vast majority of them will not be in the land. They will be trying to figure out how to interpret well. Many of them will not speak Hebrew. And so they're starting to say, well,
That's a
how do I
fascinating
read
thought.
this old text?
Yeah.
So they're translating their texts into Greek with the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. They're translating into Aramaic. They really do look a lot like us.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out how then do we read and how then do we live. And so as they begin to have these hopes, when is this Son of David, when is this promised kingdom going to come? It's problematic because most of them aren't even waiting for the Roman Empire to be overthrown, because
It hadn't happened yet.
they aren't even, and some of them aren't even part of the Roman Empire. If they're in India, they're saying, okay, or they're in Ethiopia, when and how will God's kingdom be established across dozens of countries, across political boundaries, across these kind of, because are we all going to go back to Judah? Are we all going to be brought back to Israel? Is God's kingdom going to somehow expand to include all of these countries? It becomes very complex. And so all of these hopes are building up. And so that's where you have these sects start to emerge, some of which are in Palestine with the Pharisees and the Sadducees or the Essenes or these different groups that are saying, well, we have the right way of understanding and interpreting Moses.
Yeah.
And some of these things are very fascinating and even sometimes even humorous, where the Sadducees and the Pharisees have this debate. Well, we're not supposed to touch dead, creepy, crawly things, right? That transfers impurity. We're supposed to be a pure people. We've got to go to the temple to sacrifice. We've got to go to Shabbat, to Sabbath. We don't want to contract impurity. Well, we know we're not supposed to touch dead things or creepy, crawly things. So if I have a cup and I'm pouring myself tea in the morning and I look into my cup and there's a dead, creepy, crawly thing in my cup. Well, we all agree that the cup is impure. I shouldn't drink that cup. The question is, does that impurity travel up the spout of water so that now my teapot is also impure, or not? And we think about the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees being these like really liberal guys, and the Pharisees being super, Pharisaic and conservative. And actually, it was the opposite with this one. The Pharisee said, well, that's silly. Of course this pot isn't impure. It doesn't travel up the spout of water. Of course the cup's impure, but no, go ahead and drink that other water. And the Sadducees say, no, that impurity has traveled up this. You need to go take that pot of water, bury it, cleanse it. You can't use that. And so all of this kind of what we call halakha, this how do I walk, from the Hebrew word halak, and halakha is the laws and regulations by which I walk. And people are saying, I am a Jew. I want to be faithful to Moses. I want to be part of God's distinctive people. I want to be part of his plan for the redemption of the land and of the world. How do I live when I'm living in India or in Asia Minor or in Palestine? And how do I be a faithful Jew? How do I live according to God's law? I'm waiting for his redemption. I'm waiting for the Messiah to come, but it's been a long time.
Yeah.
And so those are the kinds of historical, geographical, legal, ethical questions that we find percolating around the known world, and it kind of reaches this heightened, zealous point in Palestine, because that's where the people who have returned are saying, well, if he's gonna come, he's gonna come here.
He'll be here.
He's gonna come here. So we're sitting and we're looking around and we're waiting for, when is this Son of David going to come? When is he going to come and reconstitute his throne and his kingdom? And we're going to go tell our brothers around the diaspora. And so the rabbis are sending out their sending out their disciples to teach these different communities, well, live according to this interpretation of Moses. Follow my school of thought. And so the rabbis are actively out there proselytizing these different communities to say, this is how you should live in the meantime. And then we're waiting for this Messiah to come. And so that's a lot of the historical, cultural, ethical, legal context that you find when suddenly in 32 or 30 AD, Jesus walks into the scene and begins to say, the kingdom of God is here.
Well, and let's take a step back just a moment, because you just made a statement related to, so the rabbis are sending out. Let's be really, really brutally honest here. This was not a across the board, number one, a literate society, especially in the outer lands. Secondarily, they're not necessarily knowing or being able to translate from the Hebrew. Third, access to the actual, we have access to a Bible. You can go to the bookstore and buy 20 of them if you want. They didn't have access to it. So where we have the ability, Holy Spirit driven, to interpret, to study, to see how that applies, they didn't. So they had to get their knowledge from the commentators, from the rabbis, because they couldn't go down to the local bookstore and pull a Torah out and begin to read it. It wasn't available for them. They couldn't do it.
Well, they don't have a printing press. You don't have mass multiplication of texts. It's a very careful, laborious process to write a text. So a lot of this is distributed through these kind of disciple students that are sent out to propagate and to disseminate the teachings of their rabbis. And you even find this with Ezra, who's really the first scribe. Ezra comes back from Babylon. He finds a community in Jerusalem. They don't even have a Torah scroll.
Yeah.
When they find one, they don't know how to read it. And so he comes in and says, okay, let me teach you how to read this. And so now there's this whole community of people, in some ways, kind of like your PhDs and DPhils in theology that are well educated, trying to teach people, and then you have your rabbis that are kind of your judicial pastors trying to teach people how then should you live. So there are all of these structures and hierarchies and authority structures to help the people understand, how do I be a good Jew?
Right.
And so that's where you start to insert this figure that comes into the scene, who begins to say, I have the authority to tell you what this means.
Yeah.
Not your rabbi. You have heard it said from this person, but I tell you this.
And the distinction here is that all of those structures are in place when Jesus arrives.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, he kind of set the world on its ear a little bit in the rabbinic community when he was 12 years old. I'm in my father's house. At 12 years old, without formal schooling, I'm actually challenging and having theological discussions with the rabbis about who God the Father is.
That's right. And so that is where, as we over the next couple weeks kind of turn into the message of Jesus, what is he doing? Who is he talking to? Who is he arguing against? What expectations is he fulfilling? And what expectations is he undermining?
Yes.
This is all part of the conversation that has been percolating now for 500-600 years, with history and tradition and interpretation and politics all layered into this cake. And Jesus comes in with a knife and kind of slices all the way through this multi-layer cake. And the Gospels are bringing us into that story.
Which now you begin to understand why, when Jesus said certain things, the reactions were across the board. Because, again, for 600 years, 700 years, they've been waiting for redemption, the promise of the one to come. Jesus comes in and says, I'm him.
Right.
And yet I'm him with a message that's not at all what they expected the message to be. It is, and where he went directly to was, here are the religious factions in place. Here's the structure that's in place. And I'm here to tell you the structures that are in place have nothing to do with the heart of God.
Right. Right.
I know the heart of God because, by the way, I and the Father are one. I know him. That had to have just blown the circuits of not only the Pharisees and Sadducees, but the people at the time.
That's right. And what we can get into next week is it's true that the authority structures were not prepared to accept him.
Right.
But many, many, many thousands, tens of thousands of Jews did accept him.
Yeah.
And so he didn't just come in and blow Judaism out of the water and say, forget you guys, I'm doing something different. And we'll get into this more next week, but
yeah.
The expectations that he's playing into actually did turn the world on fire.
Yeah.
And the rabbis said that the world has turned upside down because of this guy. In 2 years of ministry, everybody's gone to him. The world's upside down right now. Nobody cares about our authority structures. What happened? What just happened?
How did we lose it? Yeah.
Right. And so it's important to understand that Jesus is coming in as a Jew for the Jews, fulfilling Jewish prophecy in a Jewish context, and not just a Judean context, though of course his ministry is in Judah and Israel. But he's very concerned about a broader conversation, which is, what about God's lost people? What about the lost sheep of Israel? Where are they? How will they be reconstituted? Will they return from exile? Will everybody come back to Judah? How do we place them back in fellowship with God under his authority structures within his kingdom? These are all the kind of expectations and hopes that people are looking for. And it's critical that we understand that, because as Jesus begins to teach, as we move next week into Jesus' ministry, as he begins to teach, that is the primary focus of his words. That is how we need to understand and read him before we start to jump into some of these questions about what about us, the Gentiles.
Well, and so I'm going to hold that question because where I was going to ask you to land this today was, so why should that be important to me? A Western Christian, 2,000 years after Jesus entered into this picture, why should any of this matter to me at all?
Yes, that's a terrific question, and I think there's really two primary answers. I mean, there's the geek answer, which is because we want to know history and we want to know what happened and all that kind of stuff. But from a lay level perspective, why does any of this matter? And I think that Paul in Romans 9, chapter 9, verse 1 and following, really kind of digs into the guts of this when he comes in and says, and in the end of chapter 8, who shall separate us from the love of God? Yeah. No one shall separate us from the love of God. And then the very next question will be, but what about his people, the Jews?
Yeah.
Did he abandon them?
Yeah.
And he has to come in and say, absolutely not. What we're doing today with the Gentiles, and we'll get into this here in a couple of weeks, but what God is doing for the Gentiles by bringing them into this community in a way that no one saw coming, what Paul says is the great mystery that none of us anticipated. What God is doing with this in-grafting of the Gentiles into this Jewish community is precisely to fulfill his promises to bring all Israel back under the kingdom and authority of God and under the Son of David. And so not that he has abandoned them, but in his plan, in this kind of narrative, in this redemption story, this love story that God has for Israel, he's going to use the most unlikely, unexpected people, the Gentiles, to fulfill his promises to Israel.
Yeah, and who would have thought that?
And no one saw it coming.
Yeah.
And so it's a surprise ending. It's a twist. It's
because my mind immediately goes to Peter, and Peter going, well, wait, that can't be what the plan is. Right. And God making it very clear, yes, it is. That's the plan. Oh, okay. Well, if that's the plan, then, and now you unfold the entire ministry of Paul.
Yes.
Because Paul, yes, he goes to the synagogue first, but he finds an unwelcome audience, and time after time after time after time goes to the Gentiles and finds the audience.
And that's
Nick,
really, and that's
yeah.
really going to be the rhythm of these next 3 weeks. Is let's
Yeah.
look at what Jesus is doing with his ministry. Let's look at what the apostolic ministry, when Jesus sends these apostles and these disciples out to spread the good news of Jesus' kingship to all of these thousands of communities of Jews across the known world. Why is he doing that? How does that fit? And then we'll end up week 4 with Paul and how the Gentiles are now brought into that story,
Yeah.
into that missional journey.
Yeah.
So I think it'll unfold very nicely. And,
It's wonderful.
I think we can. This is an important half an hour because it kind of sets the stage for what's going on.
Yeah.
How do we get to the point where Jesus walks into northern Galilee and is baptized by John and says, "The time for my ministry is here."
It's here. Yeah. Which is critical to us, because whether we want to acknowledge it or not, this is part of our Christian history. This is the foundation to our Christian history, and then the opening up of the door to the Gentiles for us to be grafted in. So, Nick, I'm giddy. I'm thrilled at the opportunity for us to be able to launch into this. Thank you for setting the background for us today, for setting this foundation. We will be looking next week at the mission of Jesus, specifically this mission of Jesus who comes and says the kingdom of God is here. It's at hand. It's here. And basically he says, it's in me. I've arrived. I'm the one you've been looking for. Fascinating where we're going to head with this. I look forward to seeing what that's going to unfold, the ministry to the Jews the week after that, and the ministry to the Gentiles the week after that. Thank you for spending time with us today, taking a little time away from your family, and when you're down in Florida, hopefully we'll catch you back in Dallas next week. And have a little chance to dive into this. For those of you that have joined us today, we're always welcome your questions, comments that you want to send through on this Facebook Live feed. Again, when you lock on later, send us questions, send us the things you want to talk about, because we're interested in bringing information and conversation to you about what you want to hear about. So, Nick, thank you for joining us. Audience, thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next week as we launch into the mission of Jesus out of this Jewish backdrop. Thanks for being with us. We look forward to seeing you next week on Grace Cafe.